New Jersey, a land that wears its wealth like a polished crown. From the towering glass of Jersey City's skyline to the manicured lawns of suburban enclaves, it dazzles with prosperity. But behind the gleam, behind the hum of commerce and the comfort of privilege, lurks a crisis that shatters that illusion, a crisis hidden in plain sight. This is the untold story of the Garden State's silent emergency, homelessness. In a place flush with riches, too many are left fighting for dignity beneath underpasses, in crowded shelters, or on the cold ground of city parks. The numbers alone are sobering. Rents that climb higher each month, evictions that come swift and ruthless, and an affordable housing supply that's more myth than reality. These forces push countless families, workers, and veterans to the brink, not because they failed, but because the system designed to protect them has. And as if these struggles weren't heavy enough, broader storms have darkened the horizon. Far from New Jersey's shores, decisions made in the nation's capital, tariffs against allies, trade wars with neighbors like Canada, economic policies that shift with the political winds, have sent tremors straight into the lives of the state's most vulnerable. The fallout drives up costs, rattles markets, and tightens the vice on those already barely holding on. In farm fields and factory floors, in small businesses and city streets, the ripple effects of federal uncertainty cut deep, adding fresh wounds to an already broken promise. So how does a state so rich, so filled with promise, allow so many to slip through the cracks? And how long can its communities bear the weight of these compounded crises? This is the journey we invite you on. Stay with us as we uncover the faces behind the statistics and the voices demanding change in the shadows of plenty. New Jersey paints itself as a masterpiece of contrasts. A mosaic where glass towers rise above Newark's worn streets, where Jersey City's ports pulse with commerce, and where Cape May shores seem to promise peace. On the surface, it's a land where opportunity hums through every highway and boardwalk. But look closer, and that picture begins to crack. From the dense cities to the quiet corners of farm towns, a deeper crisis spreads, cutting across the Garden State like an unhealed wound. Homelessness doesn't discriminate by zip code here. In Trenton, families squeeze into shelters that ran out of room long ago. In Atlantic City, the faded glitz of casinos casts long shadows over tents pitched in empty lots. Camden's forgotten blocks hide camps where survival is a daily negotiation. And in Patterson's crowded streets, the struggle is written on every weary face. The promise of prosperity, so vivid in New Jersey's well-tended suburbs and luxury high-rises, becomes an insult to those fighting simply to stay warm, to find a meal, to protect their dignity. Yet this is no accident of fate. It is the result of systems that have long favored the few at the expense of the many. Black residents, just a small share of New Jersey's population, shoulder a staggering portion of this burden. Their overrepresentation among the homeless a harsh reminder of inequities baked deep into the state's foundations. And as if these injustices weren't already steep, new forces press down harder. The ripple effects of erratic federal trade policies and tariffs, especially those targeting Canada, have begun to squeeze the lifelines of working families. For farmers across the state, vital imports like fertilizer, once reliable and affordable, have become costly or uncertain, driving up the price of growing food. For laborers and small businesses, the rising cost of goods, from groceries to fuel, chips away at already thin margins. Immigrant workers, many of whom keep the state's farms, factories, and restaurants running, are among the hardest hit. What was once a fight to get by has become, for too many, a fight to stay afloat amid forces far beyond their control. The grand wealth of New Jersey gleams on one side of the divide. On the other side, families, workers, and communities are being left to weather a storm they didn't create. The question that haunts every street, every shelter, every vacant lot: how can a place so rich allow so many to fall so far? New Jersey's housing landscape has become a battleground where only the most fortunate can hope to hold the line. In towns and cities once proud of their middle-class roots, the dream of a stable home now slips further from reach with every passing month. Rents surge upward, untethered from wages that barely move. Property taxes weigh heavily on both owners and tenants alike, turning shelter, the most basic of needs, into a costly gamble. When eviction protections lifted after the pandemic, the result was swift and brutal. Families who once managed to scrape by found themselves uprooted, their belongings stuffed into bags, their futures clouded in uncertainty. In Newark's dense neighborhoods, the math is merciless. Pay the rent or keep food on the table, but rarely both. Jersey City's shelter beds fill beyond capacity, and in Camden, abandoned lots provide the last refuge for those the system forgot. But as crushing as these forces already are, a new layer of hardship has been added, driven by forces far from New Jersey's borders. The escalating trade tensions with Canada have triggered unintended consequences that hit hardest where resilience is thinnest. Fertilizer costs, once steady, have soared as supply chains falter and tariffs bite. With higher costs for growing food comes higher prices at the market. Groceries, once a manageable expense for working families, now devour paychecks that were already stretched thin. For families teetering on the edge of housing insecurity, this means fewer choices and greater sacrifices. A gallon of milk, a dozen eggs, or a bag of produce becomes a question of what can be skipped to keep the landlord at bay. And with every price hike, the distance between having a home and losing it grows wider. The wealth that gleams in New Jersey's affluent suburbs could easily build bridges to stability. Instead, it stands in stark contrast to boarded-up homes in Atlantic City, where the desperate faces in Newark's food lines. The market grinds on, indifferent, as the gap between rich and poor becomes a chasm. In New Jersey, losing your job or your home isn't just a setback, it's often the first step on a steep slide towards homelessness. The end of eviction protections after the pandemic opened the floodgates, and the tidal wave that followed swept away families who'd clung to stability by their fingernails. Overnight, apartments emptied as landlords cashed in, and renters who fell behind by even a month found themselves out on the street, their lives reduced to what they could fit in a few bags. But it's not just the rent that's suffocating. The state's minimum wage barely covers a fast food meal, let alone the towering costs of shelter, power, and groceries. The math doesn't add up. Not for the single mom in Camden, not for the aging veteran in Trenton, and not for the immigrant worker trying to make a life in Patterson. One missed paycheck, one medical bill, one broken-down car, and the bottom falls out. Yet lurking beneath these personal crises is a storm of larger forces, making everything harder. The trade disputes with Canada, once a distant headline, have come home to roost. Farmers who once sold crops across the border now see their markets drying up, their harvests fetching less even as their costs climb. The tariffs and shifting trade rules have made it harder to export what they grow, and easier for bigger operations elsewhere to edge them out. Small farm owners, the backbone of rural New Jersey, are left scrambling, unable to cover loans or make payroll. And when the farm struggles, the entire local economy feels the shock. The small businesses that rely on agricultural prosperity, from tractor repair shops to family diners, see fewer customers, tighter margins, and doors closing earlier each night. Jobs that once seemed secure, that fed families for generations, have become as fragile as the soil they work. In towns across the state, laborers who built their lives around these industries now find themselves unemployed with no clear path back. And immigrant workers, too, are caught in this squeeze. Many came seeking the promise of steady work in New Jersey's fields or processing plants. But as orders slow and employers cut back, they are among the first to lose hours, then jobs. With legal status often precarious and no safety net to fall back on, the descent into homelessness can be terrifyingly fast. And still, the state's wealth gleams on, untouched by the suffering that spreads beneath it. The median income in its wealthiest suburbs might top 6 figures, but that prosperity feels like a world away to those camped out in parking lots, sleeping in cars, or lining up at overburdened shelters. This isn't just a failure of individual resilience, it's a failure of a system that offers no cushion, no second chance. How long can this imbalance hold before something breaks? The breakout from Newark's Delaney Hall in June 2025 wasn't just an escape, it was a desperate cry for survival. 4 undocumented immigrants risked everything, fleeing a facility notorious for its bleak conditions, where hunger and squalor eroded hope faster than time. 2 remain at large, fugitives hunted by a $22,000 bounty, their names whispered in fear across communities already living in the shadows. What followed wasn't just manhunts or headlines. It was a city ignited. Protesters filled Newark streets, outraged by a system that seemed designed to break spirits rather than uphold justice. Mayor Ras Baraka's own arrest, after condemning the cruelty, became a symbol of resistance, a rare voice challenging federal force with human decency. Yet beneath the chants and banners lies a deeper, quieter tragedy. New Jersey's homelessness crisis and its immigration struggle are threads of the same fraying fabric. Aggressive deportation tactics don't just send people into hiding, they push families into alleys, under bridges, and into the abandoned shells of buildings. In a state where shelters can barely hold those who come with nothing but hope, migrant families stay away, terrified that seeking a bed might mean losing their freedom. And if fear drives them from help, economic hardship fences them in. The same trade disputes and tariff wars that have rattled farmers and small businesses have delivered a 1-2 punch to immigrant communities. Many built their lives around industries now staggering under the weight of disrupted supply chains, lost export markets, and rising costs. Jobs once plentiful, in fields, in processing plants, in small factories, have dried up or shrunk back. For the undocumented, there is no unemployment check, no safety net, no second chance. So they slip further into invisibility, forced to choose between the risk of detention and the certainty of hunger. In Camden, entire families crowd into derelict buildings, too frightened to seek aid, too proud to give up. In Newark, they join protests not just to denounce injustice, but to remind the world that they exist. The breakout at Delaney Hall wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a larger collapse, a safety net shredded by policy, indifference, and fear. In the shadows of wealth, how can New Jersey continue to ignore these cries? How long before the invisible become impossible to overlook? COVID-19 didn't just test New Jersey's resilience, it fractured communities and stripped away the illusions of safety net systems meant to protect the vulnerable. As the virus swept through cities and small towns alike, lockdowns stole away jobs, gutted small businesses, and left entire neighborhoods gasping for stability. When eviction protections evaporated in 2022, the aftermath was swift and merciless. Families evicted en masse, their belongings scattered on sidewalks, their futures left in limbo. Shelters, already stretched thin, could offer little refuge. Social distancing slashed capacity, shutting doors to those most in need. Cars, park benches, and abandoned lots became makeshift homes, the last stops on a descent fueled by forces far beyond individual control. Nearly half of New Jersey's homeless now battle mental health challenges, their struggles deepened by isolation, loss, and despair. Domestic violence surged behind closed doors, trapping survivors with nowhere safe to run. But the scars of the pandemic didn't fade when case counts dropped. In fact, the crisis deepened as federal leadership faltered, offering no clear path to rebuild. Policies were reactive, fragmented, leaving states like New Jersey to patch the holes as best they could. And while communities were still reeling, trade disputes and erratic tariffs, especially with Canada, delivered another blow. Rural economies that depend on exports,
Urban small businesses reliant on stable supply chains all found themselves on even shakier ground. Today, whether in Camden's strained clinics or Jersey City's crowded lots, the weight of these compounded crises presses hard. Recovery feels out of reach when the foundation keeps shifting. The virus may have passed its peak, but its aftermath, worsened by policy missteps and economic turmoil, still bleeds through New Jersey's streets. In New Jersey, the crisis of homelessness isn't just measured in lost homes. It's written in sleepless nights, frayed nerves, and invisible scars. Nearly half of the state's 12,680 unhoused residents battle mental health challenges that gnaw at resilience day by day. 13% are survivors of domestic violence, mothers clutching children close as they flee danger, only to find no safety waiting. And all of them move through a landscape where help is in short supply. Shelters strain under demand, with just 9,000 beds spread across a sea of need. Clinics in Newark and Trenton are overwhelmed, unable to meet the flood of trauma, depression, and anxiety that the crisis has unleashed. Gaps in care swallow the vulnerable whole, leaving veterans battling PTSD beneath the glow of streetlights, and families navigating trauma with no support in sight. Chronic illness compounds the misery, as those too sick to work or too weak to endure are pushed onto unforgiving sidewalks. But these personal battles don't happen in a vacuum. They're made heavier by forces far beyond any one person's control. As trade disputes rattle the economy and tariffs drive up costs, the price of basics, food, energy, daily essentials climbs ever higher. A bag of groceries that once stretched a tight budget now empties a wallet. Heating a small apartment in winter or keeping the lights on becomes another impossible choice. And with each added stress, mental health wounds deepen, the pressure mounting on those already carrying more than most could bear. This is the cruel paradox of New Jersey, a state wealthy enough to heal these wounds, yet stalled by inertia and indifference. From Trenton's shelters to Atlantic City's shadows, the stories echo the same. People asking not for charity, but for a system that works. The cost of doing nothing grows steeper with every day. How long before the invisible become impossible to overlook? New Jersey finds itself caught between the promise of compassion and the pull of complacency. A state flush with resources, yet paralyzed by bureaucracy and hesitation. While housing-first models have reshaped the futures of thousands elsewhere, here in the Garden State, red tape strangles progress. Families in Patterson, veterans in Camden, women escaping violence in Trenton all wait for solutions that should already be within reach.